thoughts with you today on China's Maritime Silk Road and its implications for the U.S. Navy and the global maritime supply chain. I just want to note briefly that the views I express today are my own, and they're not those of CNA or the Department of Defense. As a result of China's Maritime Silk Road initiative, Chinese state-owned firms have spent billions of dollars on maritime infrastructure. They now build and operate port facilities around the globe. And this raises a number of implications for the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Coast Guard. As a result of these investments, China is likely improving its ability to collect intelligence on U.S. ships and assets operating in ports overseas. These investments are also allowing China to develop the capabilities that could be used later, such as the capability to interfere with U.S. Navy repair or resupply operations, or the ability to deny U.S. Navy access to certain ports altogether in times of crisis. So first, just to provide some brief background, what are the most common types of Chinese presence in overseas port facilities? So fundamentally, Chinese state firms have expanded their presence in three ways: constructing new port facilities or upgrading existing infrastructure, purchasing stakes in port terminal operators, and operating port facilities directly. Second, Beijing has a record of using economic tools to advance foreign policy objectives, and I see three tools in particular that Chinese SOEs could use to influence activities in overseas ports. One is China's foreign direct investment, which Chinese SOE executives often argue can turn a foreign country into the next economic miracle, just as FDI did for China, for example. Another tool is debt. China has become a major creditor to many emerging economies, and several may have trouble servicing their debts in the near term. And a third is bribery, and we've already seen examples where Chinese executives have sought to channel money to foreign government officials and their family members in countries where they want to do business. So using these tools, who might China target? Well, first, as I just mentioned, we've already seen Chinese firms attempt to influence national-level leaders and their family members with gifts of cash. A second target would be officials that run overseas ports, and this would include actors such as freight forwarding companies, husbanding agents, port captains, or port authorities. These are the individuals that know when ships arrive, where those ships dock, what they carry, where they store their cargo, and when that cargo gets picked up. So Chinese officials could potentially obtain useful information through these relationships. A third would be local leaders that control access to the areas surrounding the port, and Chinese firms often seek to develop these areas as part of a larger all-encompassing development model. And all this brings me to my most important issue. What might China do to affect U.S. Navy or U.S. Coast Guard port operations overseas? And I see four issues. First, I think it's worth noting that Chinese overseas expansion may create challenges for the U.S. Navy, regardless of whether or not this is China's intent. More Chinese commerce and Chinese activity means that in some locations, the U.S. Navy or the U.S. Coast Guard may face more competition, with more ships vying for limited facilities. A second issue is that Chinese state firms may be able to collect intelligence on the movement and the location of U.S. Navy ships, ship maintenance requirements, combat readiness, and the procedures that the U.S. Navy uses for repair, resupply, and other activities while they're operating in foreign ports. Moreover, as Chinese firms work with Huawei and others on port IT infrastructure issues, this puts U.S. Navy communications and other information at risk as well. Third, China could potentially pressure non-Chinese firms to give U.S. Navy or U.S. Coast Guard ships lower priority than they currently enjoy, thus slowing down services and potentially throwing ships off their schedules. To be clear, I don't have any examples of this happening to date, but given China's importance to the maritime industry, firms that provide services to the U.S. Navy may have enough commercial interest in China to be sensitive to these types of overtures. And then fourth, China could seek to restrict U.S. Navy access to ports where Chinese SOEs have a large presence in order to express their displeasure at U.S. activities. However, I have to say I do find such an action to be unlikely to date, primarily for two key reasons. First, it would certainly make other countries sit up and take notice at a time when countries are already concerned about ceding sovereignty to China. Second, and perhaps most importantly, U.S. Navy ships visiting these ports may provide intelligence collection opportunities, so China has an interest in those visits continuing. Regardless, responding to China's growing role in overseas maritime infrastructure will require careful consideration from the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Coast Guard about where, when, and how it operates in overseas ports in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Becker. Ms. Walsh.